Alright, well, we've examined to date just some of the purposes of report writing, and we have looked at the importance of patient records when they're used as evidence in excuse me, either civil or criminal proceedings and or coronial inquiries, and we've spoke about the value of good nursing records when they're used as evidence when they're really good. We've also given examples when they're bad, but we're now going to look at just an overview of the principles of good report writing or good documentation practices. Now again, this is an adjunct to many of your other subjects in clinical subjects where you're doing this on a day-to-day basis, but again, I think we should focus on where to find information and having an idea of the guidelines that are in place. So some of the key organisations that have issued guidelines and principles for documentation are New South Wales Health and also the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association. There's one that you might not think. So I'll just bring that up, the first document. So the link to this document is contained within your module, and this is the Policy Directive on Healthcare Records Documentation and Management. And it's particularly important because I want to refer you down to section 7, I think it is. Let's just look. Yeah, actually it's standards. Sometimes I get confused, but no, sorry. Apologies, it's not section 7, that's another document we're looking at. Just keep scrolling. Standards for documentation, my apologies, here we are. Documentation in healthcare must comply with the following. There we are. Now obviously with the EMR, electronic management system that's now been rolled out across most New South Wales hospitals by now, there's some information relating to that as well. So whenever you are working in an institution, make sure if you haven't used EMR, well obviously you will have in services in relation to that, and make sure you read the documentation surrounding that. But generally, in relation to principles, whether it's electronic or handwritten, these principles that we'll talk about are fairly broad. So it doesn't matter whether you're handwriting them or whether you're recording them electronically, it doesn't really matter. So we'll go through some of those, and I'll just show you another document as well, just bear with me. Now this website is the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association. Now this is another repository, it's not the NMBA. Remember, the NMBA is your registering authority or body, but when you need protection or you need advice, this is where you come. So some of you may be members, some not, but as a student, I would encourage you, and I know when you began in O Week that sometimes the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives reps come around and they really do give you a lot of information. They've got lots of useful publications. The LAMP is great. And particularly policies and guidelines. So I'm on that policies and guidelines website, and in addition to your health policies, this one here, this is a good little summary of just New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association Guide on Documentation and Electronic Documentation. So have a look at that, and again the link is in your module. Just highlighted where you can find information. Now we're going to go through just some of the principles that overarch the practice of documentation and how to achieve good standards for practice. So we'll begin with continuity of care. So healthcare records are used to promote continuity of a person's care across a number of services. So it's all about integrated report writing. It sort of harks back to the old days when nursing notes were kept separate from doctor's notes, physio notes, but now we've introduced an integrated system, and obviously it's a lot safer. you only have to look at the case of Mark McCabe. That was the young man who died as a result of septicemia because his pathology notes were filed away. There was a whole host of problems, but one of the things was that, the notes were filed separately, so no one read them. That was the first problem. But the fact that they were not in an integrated reporting system. So all about continuity of care is really important. Now, the second principle is that reading patient records. There is a real need to ensure that you read your patient's records thoroughly and regularly. So clearly the verbal handover is generally a very efficient way of quickly reporting on all patients. However, the verbal report, it really needs to be seen as an adjunct to the recorded or electronic or written report and not a substitute for it. Important information and or pathology results that may not have been mentioned in the verbal report may not be known and noted. Sometimes it's too late, and that was like, again, with the Mark McCabe incident. So reading your records, obviously, you know about that. The principle of authenticity is an important one because there's been many cases cited where nurses have transcribed information on behalf of another colleague and getting into real difficulty. And one of the real problematic areas that have come to the courts in the past is to do with fluid balance charts. In fact, there was quite a famous case, I think it's cited in Staunton, where a child died, and when it came under close and careful scrutiny, what at point was the fluid balance chart, and the child was dehydrated, so sort of input and output was central to the examination, and it was discovered that one of the nurses on night shift hadn't made any recording at all of the output of the child, but it reported in a verbal report that the child had passed urine several times. So when the day shift nurse came on and over the day she looked at the fluid balance chart, saw nothing, she actually recorded it there for her, and it was just... So when the first nurse had to give evidence, said no, there was no recording, and then the other one overrode it. It was just a debacle, basically, and both nurses as witnesses were not credible, and this was commented on by the judge. So you should never make an entry on behalf of another nurse. Common sense, but some people do it, okay? And it should be factual and a true record of what actually took place. Apologies for the background noise in the previous slide. I'm recording in my room, and despite the note on the door, sometimes people get a little noisy outside, so apologies for that. So I hope it's a little quieter, guys. So we're moving along now with the principles of good documentation. We're up to relevant and timely. So all records of an episode of a person's care are relevant to that individual. And just a note about really be careful in terms of the tone that's adopted in your writing, and for example, being prejudicial, derogatory or irrelevant. Now, from a legal perspective, apart from being disrespectful and anything else, but I'll just focus on the legal perspective where you can get into trouble. For example, if you were to note a derogatory comment and something like an example like patient was whining in a pain, or patient was whinging and whining, and then you actually recorded that in the healthcare record, and then subsequently there was a complaint lodged, and of course the notes or the coronial through that process, the healthcare records are looked at carefully. This notation could be an actual gift for the plaintiff's counsel, because it already says to the patient's legal representation that you have a bias against them. So when you're prejudicial, when you're racist, when you're derogatory, apart from being disrespectful, there's also that legal ramification that, is irrefutable because it's there in writing. So be very, very careful. Now, the other issue in terms of principle is that, is contemporaneous reporting. Traditionally, nurses have always written their reports at the completion of each shift. There was no legal reason for doing so. It was just a culture, and that's what happened. But you can see that it's much more appropriate to make a relevant entry as soon as possible after an incident or an episode of care occurs. So the rationale for that, not only will you have better recall, in some cases if you wait until the completion of the shift, that episode may have been overtaken by subsequent events, so it might become out of date, if you know. Or if a patient's condition worsens, or various treatments are commenced and tests undertaken. So yeah, trying to recreate the accurate sequential order of the episode of care can actually be quite confusing if you wait to the end of a shift. So that's why they advise contemporaneous reporting. Alright, so make sure you know about that, about, you know, dating, time, signatory, all of that. Another important principle is that reports should be accurate, brief, and complete. Accuracy is obviously essential, and it's important to distinguish between what is personally observed and what is related as part of a patient's complaint of illness or injury. For example, the difference in the record between writing patient assaulted by 2 men and patient reported that he had been assaulted by 2 men. So, you know, you need to be very careful. Unless the assault was actually witnessed, the patient complaint of injury is clearly hearsay evidence and must be reported as such. Brief and complete may sound like a contradiction in terms, but primarily what is important here is to avoid unnecessary verbosity or padding out or things like that. All right. As part of ensuring the reports are complete, reference should always be made where a patient refuses any treatment. So this is really important. So, you know, just as always you report dressings or interventions, it's always important that you report where a patient refuses treatment or there is another something they want to leave or anything like that. So, because remember, the onus is on you as a witness, if that's the case, is that you did it, and if it's not written, it's not done. A note about legibility as well. If reports are still being handwritten, then they should be legibly written. Incorrect interpretation of a person's handwriting has led to many mistakes in the past, and one of the famous cases is the Norton v. Argonaut insurance company case, and this was a nurse who was assisting on a pediatric ward due to a staffing shortage. She carried out her physician's order, which read, "Give 3 cc's of Lanoxin today for 1 dose only." She did not contact the physician to confirm the route. Her previous experience had been with injectable Lanoxin only. She gave the dose intramuscularly instead of orally as intended, and the infant died. The nurse was found negligent for administering medication she was unfamiliar with and for neglecting to clarify the order with the prescribing physician. So, you know, she couldn't read the writing. So if unsure, always check. Remember that some computer programs have predictive text and autocorrect, which can create problems if the language is technical and not easily recognised by the computer program. So yes, always check that. One of the most important principles is this ability to write objectively, and this will become particularly important when you do your second assessment, obviously, or if you have to write a statement or anything like that. It's opinions. Your opinions are subjective, they're open to interpretation, and they are not accepted by courts. So you've been given lots of examples, you know, whether in your clinical subject, but you shouldn't avoid writing things like patient appears to be drunk. Should be patient presented to the emergency department at 0300 hour. Patient was observed to be unsteady on feet, speech slurred, breath smells strongly of alcohol. The word appears is just not appropriate. So always, again, factual, accurate, complete, and limiting the interpretation by another outside person is the game. Now, I also just be mindful of abbreviations. Abbreviations should not be used in reports unless they are accepted healthcare organisation abbreviations. So there is a standardised policy on that, so always adhere to that, particularly in the traditional historical, where there was lots and lots of different examples of abbreviations for, you know, incidents of care. For example, sat out of bed used to be SOOB, which is just, what does that mean? And again, this has come to the fore in courts when, you know, witnesses, nurses of witnesses have been closely interrogated over some of the things they might have written in their report. So be mindful of abbreviation, and also errors. Be aware of the policy in, you know, both from the electronic management perspective or handwritten, that you never obliterate an incorrect entry, and always, you know, in terms of if you're doing handwritten recordings, always check name, you know, the identifying number, all of that, you know, and never ever transcribe. So be very careful. So in summary, documentation is an essential component of the day-to-day work of a nurse. It's like everything we do, you have to meet an acceptable standard. It has legal as well as clinical significance. So hopefully this module has highlighted the legal ramifications of failure to document appropriately and the importance of adhering to standards for practice in that regard. Quality documentation equates to quality nursing care, and you know, you never want to be called into question. It's bad enough being called as a witness when something goes wrong or a patient dies and it's a coronial inquiry, but doubly worse when it's you may have been rushed. It might have been one of those days where you just didn't, you know, document as well as you could have or should have, or you didn't adhere to particular standards. You might have put in a word there that could really come back to bite you, or worst of all, you don't document anything at all and you actually cared for that patient. So yeah, big area. So hopefully this has highlighted some of the things to look for.